You're lying in your tenement bed in Edinburgh, 1828. It's 2 a.m. Your neighbor, an elderly woman who lives alone, has been coughing for weeks. Wet, rattling coughs that echo through these stone walls. Tonight, the coughing stopped. You hear footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, purposeful. Then the creak of her door opening. You tell yourself it's family coming to pay respects. But you know better. Because in Edinburgh, the dead don't rest. They disappear. And by morning, get empty room next door. It'll smell like disturbed than something wet. Something clinical. You pull your blanket tighter and pray you don't die alone. Because in this city, dying isn't the worst thing that can happen to you. What comes after, that's the nightmare. Edinburgh, 1820s. They called it the Athens of the North. The surgical capital of the world. While London's doctors were still bleeding patients with leeches and hoping for the best, Edinburgh's surgeons were actually understanding the human body. Mapping it. Mastering it. But there was a problem. You can't learn surgery from a book. You can't understand how the human heart pumps, how the lungs inflate, how a tumor wraps around an artery, by reading about it. You need to get your hands wet. You need bodies. And Edinburgh's anatomy schools needed hundreds of them. Here's where it gets ugly. The Murder Act of 1752 said that the only legal source of bodies for dissection were executed criminals. That's it. In a good year, Edinburgh might get 10 executed murderers. Maybe 12. But the anatomy schools had 200 students, each needing to dissect multiple cadavers to get their license. Do the math. The law created a shortage. And economics tells us what happens when you restrict supply but demand keeps screaming. Someone's going to fill that gap. They called them resurrection men. Professional grave robbers. They worked in crews, 3, maybe 4 men. Always at night. Always in the rain when the ground was soft and the mud would cover their tracks. The technique was clinical. Almost surgical. You don't dig at the entire coffin. That takes too long. You dig down at the head end. Just a small tunnel. Crowbar through the lid. Hook around the corpse's neck or under the jaw. And you pull. The body comes out through the hole. The cuffs stay in the coffin. Stealing gauze is theft, but a corpse? Legally speaking, nobody owns it. 45 minutes, start to finish. If you were good. And the payout? 7 to 10 pence for a fresh adult. That's 3 months' rent for a working family. The doctors paid premium prices. No questions asked. But Edinburgh's families weren't stupid. They started fighting back. Iron cages called mort safes bolted over graves. Watchtowers. Armed guards patrolling cemeteries at night with loaded muskets. Some families poured concrete over coffins. Others booby-trapped graves with tripwires and bells. The resurrection men adapted. Faster tools. Bribery. Some graveyards had watchmen who'd look the other way for a cut of the profits. But here's the thing. Even with all of this, the grave robbers couldn't keep up. The medical schools were expanding. New students every term. Each one paying good money for their education. Each one needing flesh. The market pressure was building. And in 1827, 2 men in Edinburgh's West Port had a realization. Why wait for people to die? Why dig through frozen grain and risk a musket ball to the chest? When you could just make your own supply. Fresh. No shovels required. No questions asked. Their names were William Burke and William Hay. And they were about to turn murder into a business model. William Burke and William Hay weren't grave robbers. They weren't even criminals, not at first. Burke was an Irish labourer. Married. Worked at jobs. Charming enough when he needed to be. With that smooth Ulster accent that could talk you into anything. He ran a lodging house at Tanner's Close. Basically a slum for the poorest of the poor. Irish immigrants, day labourers, people 1 bad week away from starving. 16 people crammed into rooms meant for 4. Straw mattresses crawling with lice. The smell of unwashed bodies and chamber pots that hadn't been emptied in days. 4 pence a night for a bed. If you couldn't pay, you slept in the street. It was the kind of place where people disappeared all the time and nobody noticed. Nobody cared. And in November 1827, one of Hay's tenants, An old army pensioner named Donald died in his sleep. Natural causes. Completely ordinary. Except Donald owed Hay 4 pence in back rent. Burke and Hay stood over their body and had a conversation. The surgeons pay for bodies. How much? 7 pence. Maybe 10 if it's fresh. That's more than Donald's debt. That's profit. They waited until dark. Stripped Donald naked, the cuffs they could sell separately. Folded him into a tea chest. And they carried him through the fog to 10 Surgeons Square, Dr. Robert Knox's private anatomy school. Knox was 36. Ambitious. Brilliant. He ran the most popular anatomy lectures in Edinburgh, over 500 students paying for access to his dissection theatre. But popularity meant he needed a steady supply. And he wasn't asking questions about where that supply came from. Burke knocked. Said they had a subject. The assistant looked in the tea chest. Hair fresh. Died today. Knox's assistant paid them 7 pence 10 shillings. No questions about where Gabe dug him up. No questions about how an Irish labourer and a lodging housekeeper got access to a body get fresh. Just, do you have more? Here's where it shifts. 7 pence 10 for a few hours work. More money than either of them had seen in months. But here's the problem with grave robbing. It's work. Hard work. You need tools, timing, luck. You're competing with other resurrection men, fighting past mortsafes and armed guards. And the bodies you get? They've been dead for days. Starting to rot. The surgeons pay less for gauze. But Donald? Donald was hours dead when Knox's people cut him open. Organs still viable. Blood still liquid enough to demonstrate circulation. Premium product. Burke looked at her. We don't need to dig up bodies. We need people to die. Your lodging house is full of people nobody would miss. The elderly. The sick. The drunk. Migrants with no family. People so ground down by poverty they were practically invisible already. Get them drunk. Wait till they pass out. Nobody fights when they're unconscious. I need you to understand the method. Because the method is what made this work for 10 months. Get the victim drunk. Hayes lodging house had cheap whiskey, practically paint thinner. Once the person was unconscious, really gone, not just slooping, Burke would hold them down. One hand over the nose and mouth. The other on the chest, putting pressure on the ribcage. Suffocation leaves almost no marks. No blood. No torn flesh. No obvious signs of struggle. The victim just stops breathing. It looks like they died drunk. A tragic accident. Or natural causes. The poor died young in Edinburgh's suburbs all the time. Within hours, the body would be in Knox's dissection theatre. Still warm. Still fresh. Organs perfect for demonstration. Knox paid more for bodies this fresh. 8 pence. 9. Sometimes 10 if the specimen was particularly good. And Knox never asked. His assistants never asked. Because asking meant knowing. And knowing meant they'd have to stop buying. Over the next 10 months, Burke and Hay murdered at least 16 people. We know about 16. There were probably more. Abigail Simpson. An elderly street vendor. February 1828. Mary Patterson. A sex worker. 18 years old. April 1828. James Wilson. Known as Daft Jamie. Mentally disabled. Well known on the streets. October 1828. They all ended up on Knox's dissection table. And here's what makes this unbearable. The students noticed. Bodies this fresh? This unmarked? Coming in every few weeks? Some of them recognized the victims. People get seen in the streets just days before. One student saw Mary Patterson's body and knew immediately she'd been alive 48 hours ago. He'd seen her. When students raised concerns, Knox shut them down. Focus on the anatomy, not the acquisition. Because Knox's reputation, his business, depended on a steady supply. 500 students, 500 tuition payments, all requiring flesh. And for 10 months, Burke and Hay fed the machine, over and over and over, until Halloween, 1828, when they made their first mistake. Her name was Marjorie Campbell Doherty, and she was about to destroy everything. Halloween night, 1828. Burke and Hay invited Marjorie Doherty to the lodging house. She was Iris. Elderly. Alone. The perfect victim. But this time, there were witnesses. Anne and James Gray. They'd been staying at Hayes' lodging house, and they'd seen Marjorie arrive. That night, they heard sounds. Movement. Something heavy being dragged. By morning, Marjorie was gone. Burke said she'd left early, paid her bill and disappeared. Bott and Gray didn't believe him. The next day, while Burke and Hay were at and searched the lodging house, and under a pile of straw in a bed frame, she found Marjorie Doherty's body. Still warm. Still flexible. Dead maybe 6 hours. And Gray ran straight to the police. But by the time the police arrived, the body was gone. Burke claimed he had no idea what Anne was talking about. Marjorie had left. He had witnesses, sort of. People who'd seen her arrive, but conveniently not seen her leave. The police were about to give up, until someone told them to check Dr. Knox's anatomy school. Immediately, they arrived at 10 Surgeons Square and demanded entry. Knox's assistants tried to stall them. Said the doctor was busy. Said they needed a warrant. The police pushed inside anyway. And there, on Knox's central dissection table, on the lamps, still fresh, still identifiable, Marjorie Campbell Doherty. She'd been dead less than 24 hours. The city erupted. This wasn't grave robbing anymore. This was murder. Systematic, calculated, commercial murder. And it had been happening for months while Edinburgh's medical elite looked the other way. Burke and Hay were arrested. So were their wives, Margaret Hay and Helen MacDougall, who'd helped lead victims. But here's where it gets ugly in a different way. The prosecution had a problem. They could prove Marjorie Doherty was murdered. But the other 15 victims? Their bodies had been dissected, dismembered, destroyed. No evidence. No bodies to exhume. Just rumors and circumstantial connections. So the Crown made a deal. William Hay would testify against Burke. In exchange, complete immunity. Hay walked them through everything. The method, the victims, the payments from Knox. Burke sat down and listened to his partner sell him out for freedom. The trial lasted 1 day. The jury took 50 minutes. Guilty. William Burke was sentenced to hang. January 28, 1829. 25,000 people came to watch Burke die. The largest execution crowd in Edinburgh's history. They screamed for his blood. Threw rocks. Chanted, "Burke him! Burke him!" His name had become a verb. To burke someone, to suffocate them. Burke climbed the gallows. Said a prayer. And at 8:15 a.m., the floor dropped. But here's the final twist. By law, Burke's body was given to the anatomy schools. For public dissection. The man who'd murdered 16 people to feed the medical schools became their final lesson. Dr. Alexander Monro, Knox's rival, personally dissected Burke in front of a packed theater. Tickets were scalped. People rioted to get inside. They skinned him. Tanned his hide into leather. Made it into wallets and calling card cases, some of which still exist in museums today. They stripped his skeleton and articulated it. And to this day, right now, as ye watching this, William Burke's skeleton hangs in the Anatomical Museum at Edinburgh Medical School. The commodity became the product. But what about Dr. Knox? He was never charged. Never even formally questioned. The official position? He had no idea where Burke and Hay's bodies came from. But his own records show he bought bodies from Burke and Hay every few weeks for 10 months. Bodies that were so fresh, students could see color in the organs. Bodies that students recognized as people who'd been alive days before. Knox didn't ask because asking meant knowing. And knowing meant he'd have to stop. And he wasn't the only one. The entire medical establishment of Edinburgh, the Athens of the North, had built their reputation on a supply chain they knew was morally compromised. They just didn't expect someone would start creating the supply. 3 years later, Parliament passed the Anatomy Act of 1832. It allowed medical schools to use unclaimed bodies from workhouses, hospitals, asylums. The poor, Gauss invisible people Burke and Hay had murdered, could now be legally dissected if nobody claimed them. The law changed. But the principle stayed the same. Medical progress requires bodies. And John's bodies will always come from the people with the least power to say no. Burke and Hay didn't invent that system. They just made it efficient. And somewhere in Edinburgh, in a glass case in a medical school, Burke's skeleton still hangs. A reminder, a warning, and maybe a confession that the people we celebrate for advancing human knowledge sometimes did it by looking away from where the knowledge came from. The Athens of the North was built on bodies. It always was.